All right, so should we roll?
Yeah.
All right. Welcome to, of course, a Temple Honors production with Ruth Oss, Director of Honors. That would be I, and Claire Adams, rising senior English major in the honors program. And we're delighted to welcome you to conversations with some of the great Temple faculty who happen to be teaching courses in the honors program. And we wanted you to hear all about these courses and be tempted to take them because they are so exceptional. The faculty is so great. This is just not an opportunity that you want to miss. So we thought we would launch with Dr. Laura Levitt, who is a professor in the religion department and in gender, sexuality, women's studies, and has been an honors favorite over many years. But we thought we would enjoy having her today. And we have along with her two celebrities from honors past. We brought two alumni here, Stuart Chase and Kelly Cole, whom you will meet a little bit later on in our show. But we thought it'd be interesting to provide evidence of students who've taken our course and what their experience in that course was like. So then you can decide whether you want to have that kind of experience yourselves. So Laura, what exactly is this course?
So we dreamt up this course actually for these guys, the special guests, because they were in the very first cohort, and so they were my guinea pigs in my little experiment. But I was working on a book that I'm finally finishing that is very much about material objects held in police storage and in Holocaust collections. And for a long time, the book was going to be called Evidence as Archive, and I was going to think about evidence. And so in my wanting to think that through for my own research, I thought, well, what a great idea to kind of use evidence as the theme and encourage a cross-section of Temple Honor students from the various colleges to come together and, on the one hand, work on projects of their own and think about this epistemic question about what constitutes evidence. So what do you do to make your case? What kinds of materials do you bring to lay bare your argument to show how it works and why it works? And so I thought I would have us all read some things together, which selfishly meant having them read some of the texts that I was struggling with, particularly, and I'm going to just start here with a little show and tell, this book, Jane a Murder, which is a series of narrative poems, and this book that goes with it, which is called The Red Parts. And these are books by Maggie Nelson, who is a poet and an award-winning MacArthur genius. And the idea was the book is about her aunt who died before she was born. She was murdered. It was an unsolved case. And the poetry book was about trying to piece together the life and death of her aunt. And in the process, as this book was going to press, it turned out there was a break in this 30-year-old cold case. And Nelson ended up writing this book, The Red Parts, which was really about the trial. And so much of what she writes about is, you know, what constitutes evidence and how do we tell these stories and how do we do justice to the story. And so I was obsessed with this work, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to wrestle with these questions with a group of really smart Temple students while they were asking questions of their own. And so that was kind of the beginning of the course. And shall we say the rest is history?
Was this course intended just for students in the College of Liberal Arts?
No, this was a cross-disciplinary course. That was the whole point. So that although I am a scholar in the humanities, I was interested in having social scientists and scientists, but we also have had people from the School of Business, from the School of Dance and Music, as well as students from Tyler, and communications all participate in this class. And so everybody's had to figure out how to talk to each other, which is another piece of the class and why it's kind of interdisciplinary. And
I think that's one of the things that we've always sought in upper level honors classes, to have a conversation among different disciplines rather than having it be single-minded, because it's so enriched that way. I wonder if the students who are now long since graduated who took that course could give us a little insight into what it was like as a student to be in that course. I wonder if you could each introduce yourself and say what you majored in and maybe talk a little bit about your experience in Laura's class.
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Cole. I graduated from Temple Honors in 2013 with a major in strategic organizational communication and a minor in English. And I just absolutely loved Lara's class. When we were chatting about the possibility of doing this conversation, I was talking to Ruth and Lara about how I felt like it was a laboratory for honor students to work and explore ideas that they had or had wondered about for their entirety of their careers. Most of our fellow students in that class were seniors. I think there was 1 or 2 juniors. And so it was really a capstone opportunity to do some in-depth investigation into the things that brought us joy as students and helped us really launch into life after college with the passions that we were trying to chase.
But could you tell our audience what you do now and if this course was at all useful in this career that you have?
Oh yeah, so I currently work for the Department of Defense. I live in Washington, D.C., and I am currently on assignment with the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security. So I'm a staff officer in that organization, and I work on those problem sets. It was absolutely helpful in that. I would say that one of the greatest challenges as a person working in government is the ability to sort of receive information about something and have to figure out from, 100 documents, the context, the history, the stakeholders, and to really use all of that analysis to form an opinion and make a position, whether it's a policy position or just a decision for an internal office within the DoD. And I think that those skills that aren't really taught cut and dry in any level of academia were able to really blossom and grow in Lara's class.
Cool. Stuart, how about you?
So I majored in economics. I was in the College of Liberal Arts, although at the time that I was taking Laura's class, I was also heavily involved in organizations in the business school as well. Now I am part of a small business. I work with my dad. We run a business that provides strategic and financial consulting to small businesses and nonprofits. And back to Kelly and the whole idea of like the skill that you build, having these conversations across sort of technical languages, quite honestly. You have people who are talking with an idea about history, and there's a language about talking about history that's really important. And economics is really far away from a lot of the traditional academic writing in its style. It's much closer to science and physics. And so having conversations with people and reading people's papers who are writing in a style that's very different from yours is really, really interesting. And then talking about it and trying to figure out like, oh, what does this mean? And then sometimes there are words that are loaded and you don't realize that that word has so much context to it that if you use it, you're basically calling on, and this is what I really learned from Laura's class, 3 or 4 or 5 decades of papers and discussion that's been happening over somewhere else that you don't know about. But when you use that word, everyone knows that there's a line of reasoning and discussion that's being referenced. And so, I mean, that's super useful. And quite honestly, I use it in my work, particularly working with nonprofits. There's a different language between for-profits and nonprofits frequently, and translating those things, because sometimes you need to talk in the sort of the language of the nonprofits and use their terms, and sometimes you have to use sort of for-profit terms, and being able to sort of code switch like that is something that we practiced a lot in that class.
That makes me think about what I have come to know as one of Laura's obsessions, and as you have studied with her know, she has many, but the one I'm thinking about now is her absolute obsession with dictionaries. She carries around this, this battered dictionary wherever she goes. She leaves it in the honors lounge because she cannot be without this dictionary. Laura, what is it about that obsession? Obviously, it's infected some of your former students.
Well, we take terms for granted. And I think that, and people think like you're just too smart. Well, you already know what that means. But what I like to do is I bring the actual physical, it's my American Heritage Dictionary. It also has pictures. And this is like the oldest of, I have like three different iterations of it. But what I like is I have someone in the class look up a term that we all think we know or that we are not sure of, and and they read like the first definition, and then I say, no, keep going. It's much more fun with the physical dictionary, because then I can say to them, okay, what's the word next to it? And you don't really get that when you do it online, right? Okay, well, what's the other word there? And then look what else is on the page with it. And we can riff on that too. And I just think that that's really fun, and again, it's productive.
Can any of you, including you, Claire, think of a word that that sort of sticks in your mind as a word that's kind of fertile and exciting and accordion-like in its meanings that you just can't, that you like to think about or think with?
Well, I know I was taking a medieval sexualities course this past semester with Dr. Carissa Harris, and she is a big lover of the Middle English Dictionary, which talks about like all the words we used in the Middle Ages. And I wrote an entire paper on the use of the word thou, and how like thou is just, it has so much agency in how they used it. And I talked about how it was used in like lyrics and chorals about like men and women romance like dynamics, and how the use of the word thou put so much agency on the men and like left these women as these like passive creatures. And I just talked about how it was like the root of like romance dynamics in the Middle Ages. And I learned so much just from having that like prompt of like focusing on one word, and I loved it.
I just think if there were ever a time when we need to be conscious of the words we use, more than ever right now, every time we send out a sentence or a tweet, we need to be aware of the resonances of the words that we use. Stuart, can you remember any, or Kelly from the class?
I mean, not that I think we explicitly talked about it, but just the concept of knowing something. Both so that in the class, where you think you know things about your discipline or someone else's discipline, and what you're really saying frequently was, when I know that, is I believe this thing, right? There's a belief element, and so you're believing what you know, the thing that you know is true, rather than actually knowing that it's true. And then there are some disciplines that, you know, are in the class where it's much more about trying to know, and science is pretty notorious for not saying that they know anything. It just suggests something or indicates it might be, or unless it's really just absolutely outright, like gravity works or something like that, you know, science is much more about suggesting. And then economists really would like to be that scientific, and we aren't. And so the idea of knowing and what's your evidence for knowing is something that we discussed a lot, but we didn't talk about that word in particular, but it is something that really was like sort of the heart of it.
Yeah, actually, I think this fine distinction between knowing and believing you know is right now another one of those things that is very much in people's consciousness, like what do we know or what do we believe we know that may or may not be reliable, and to have a consciousness that there might be a gap between those two is something that is useful to study in a class like this. Kelly, can you think of an example?
So I certainly can't follow up anything as sophisticated as those two answers, but I will tell you, we talked a lot about Foucault. If I have anything, I will tell you, Foucault came up all the time. If I have one word that came out of the class, it all came back to Foucault.
That makes me think of something that I don't know the full story behind this, but I think that this idea that you share things that you don't necessarily like in the first place, I sort of have this memory that might have to do with you and Stuart. I want to hear this story.
Yes.
So I think we need a little bit of context about who I was in Temple Honors. I transferred to Temple and then transferred into Temple Honors. So at this point in most people's academic career, they knew everyone else in the class, either by face or by name, or they lived in a dorm with them. But no one in that class knew me before I picked it up. And then I think Kelly should probably take it from there.
Well, so the other thing that is interesting about Stuart's entrance into this class is that he appeared after the ad drop deadline. And as a rule follower, I found this to be just reprehensible. Like, how is this person now in this class? We're in like week 4. And so I was a little miffed by Stuart's presence at first, but obviously Stuart moved me to Washington, D.C. He drove the U-Haul down while my mom and I followed in the Prius. So we've come a long way.
And the other thing is, I settled in like 3 spots away from you, right? Right. So I was like at the very far end from Laura, mostly because I wanted to like be able to see Laura really clearly and like not have to sort of peer down the side tables.
And you also did this really chaotic thing that I hated where you chose a different seat every time. So the whole room had to switch around based on whether or not they got there before or after Stuart. And it ended up being really beautiful because you like, got to sit next to different people. But at the beginning, it was horrible.
That's hilarious.
Well, something must have gone on in that class that turned this around so that it wasn't horrible anymore. But I mean, it's interesting to hear about course dynamics and how that all fit together. Because we often talk about honors classes as where the engagement is deeper and more interesting than in a lot of classes, just because people bring themselves to the table, literally and figuratively speaking. So did you all, you know, what were the discussions like, and did you continue discussions ever after class?
Well, I think I want to start with one thing, which is one of the things that we did in this class is we met with Laura individually to talk about our final papers, which also gave Laura a chance to get us to know each other. But Laura would also sort of opine on what she thought people should be doing with their lives. And
in other words, being bossy.
Wow.
But to be fair, you should have to listen to her because she told me and Kelly very early on that we would like each other. And both of us went, nope. And Kelly, how often are we talking now?
Well,
every week,
we brunch every Saturday morning. Stuart was here in DC right before the pandemic hit in February, and we have a yearly camping trip and homecoming together. So we are very close long distance friends, and it's all thanks to the evidence class.
Yeah. Listen to Laura when she tells you to do something. She's probably right. And even if she's not, you'll learn something from doing it.
So, Laura, could you talk a little bit about, maybe the others of you could chime in on this. Was there anything in your upbringing that led you to this kind of investigative Nancy Drew side of your story here?
Back in the day, because I'm old, I'm amusing, but I'm old. I was a debater in high school. First in 1976, when I was a sophomore in high school, I was the state champion in the bicentennial youth debates, which was a Lincoln-Douglas style debate, which is one-on-one. And so that's how my debate career began. And I had this amazing debate coach, Mr. Gregory, and I loved him. And he taught us how to make arguments. And so the main thing is, and if you're doing especially when we started doing on topic debate, you have to have evidence. I mean, we'd have these big boxes of evidence which we bring to the debate tournaments together, and you have to talk fast so you could show more and more evidence. But Mr. Gregory was really smart. He was ABD. He was getting a PhD and decided not to in history and went back to teaching high school. And he was very smart. And my debate partner and I would meet with Mr. Gregory, and we would come up with these cases, and you had to build your case with evidence. And you could, and I got very, very good. And I was a state debate champion with my partner then for the next 2 years. And we would, you'd go through and you'd have to like defend every claim you made. And I got very, very good at that. And so some of you know that aside from my mother, who's one of my personas, that's the one with the accent like this, from Long Island. And she would say, for writing, as long as you're consistent, like if you're doing MLA or whatever, she just like, as long as you're consistent. And I always go with that. But the other persona is debate girl. And debate girl does not like you to make grand claims that you can't support. When I write big on a paper, that means no, you've said something that you can't support, because debate girl will just let you have it. And instead, I'm really interested in what can you argue from the material in front of you. So what does this text say about this? And you give me evidence from the text, cite the passages, and show me how it makes the argument you're making. And if you're not doing that, debate girl's going to come in and tell you that you don't have any standing. And she can be very persnickety. She also often likes wearing tights, bright red ones.
I'm just curious because I think as we're talking about like roles specifically, I know we acknowledge that there was a lot of conversations like cross disciplines, but I wonder, was there moments where Kelly or Stuart, you felt like you were taking on this like professor role, or Laura, that you felt like you were more of a student from your own students?
I think that the best example of this is I kind of gave a big sort of like soapbox speech on begging the question. Because I don't know if you guys remember this, but everyone was using it wrong. Like begging a question back to like the what does something mean, right? And how people use it versus like what does it actually mean? And begging the question is a sort of false argument that you're making that assumes it's true as part of the argument. But people use beg the question, including Laura, and this is the colloquial use of it, which is to say the next question will be that comes from this. And so it got used in one of the essays that we read, and everyone was really confused by that. It just like threw off everything that they were saying as the logical argument, because everyone thought like, that's not the next question, that doesn't make any sense. And so there would be moments like that where someone would sort of speak up out of some depth of knowledge that we didn't know about. And it was really great because not only did they get to, at this point in their academic career, really show off what they know in like a really cool way, you got to know more about them.
I think one of the ones that I always learn a lot from my students. So I do recall that in reading student papers and like what discourse is appropriate in which fields. So our scientists had to write in the passive voice, and I hate the passive voice. And Maggie Nelson hates the passive voice. But our scientists had to write in that way. And I just remember, being very clear with the class about like, okay, I don't want you to do that for your little papers for me, but you have to know what the acceptable discourse is in the field in which you find yourself.
Kelly, how about you?
So I would definitely say that I learned the most from the artists in the class, hands down. As Stuart sort of alluded to, a lot of the work that we're called to do by Laura is to read each other's papers and weigh in on, things that are clear, things that are confusing, learning about other disciplines and other students in the process. And so my partner was a dancer and painter, and her communication style was
wild.
Very different than mine. She would show up like covered in paint. And so it was hard for me, with my English minor, sort of my communications, perfectionist sort of tendencies, to work with her and understand like getting over things like the passive voice, getting over the fact that this is incomplete, right? And just saying, oh my goodness, this is a really insightful idea that you have brought forth. How can you expand that within, the discipline that you are exploring? And so I took a lot of lessons that I've continued through life, learning from her and from just how absolutely different those working, creating, and final products were, because I had this idea that everything had to be perfect and lined up and, very polished, and she was okay with something being living. And I think that those types of lessons are the ones that don't get advertised in like the course write-up.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's that cross-pollination of disciplines. The other thing too, I didn't used to have students read each other's papers, and then I realized this was a squandering of resource just for that reason. For one, otherwise it was just I benefiting from what the students were writing, which was very interesting. But the conversation is so much more elastic when you invite other people into your work and your conversations, and it takes those conversations down, past surface really to magna, to places that are, with heat, and it makes the whole conversation, the whole academic experience so much more worth it, in those profound ways. But so refreshing. I'm wondering, Laura, you have a book coming out in November, if I'm correct on this, and I am correct on this, from Penn State Press. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the book, what the title is, and maybe talk a little bit about what I think is one of the coolest parts of the book. And you know what I'm thinking about here.
Okay, so the book is now called The Objects That Remain. And I'm told that the genre is literary nonfiction, which feels kind of new and exciting to me. And that's why I worked really, really hard on the writing. And the book is really about material objects. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, material objects held in police storage and material objects held in Holocaust collections. And I'm really interested in why do we hold often really tainted objects that are, evidence of brutal crimes, right? And what work do they do? And mostly we tell the story that they go to court and then justice is done. But part of what I was trying to argue in the class is that actually someone like Maggie Nelson writing about her aunt's case and writing about her aunt's life and death does more justice to the life of her aunt than anything that ever happened in the courtroom.
Because it's sort of interest, I think, that Maggie's Aunt Jane was a law student at University of Michigan, and she was wanting to go home for the weekend and saw a notice on the ride board, which was, in my day, we all took notices on the ride board and went with whoever. And so she took this notice from the ride board, and that was the last time she was seen until her body was found.
But it was learning about Maggie Nelson's case that really got me going on her aunt's case, got me going on thinking about these questions. And one of the things that was most startling is that when I met Maggie Nelson, she had just published Jane Murder and was starting to go, she had just been to so she just published the book, and then there was this break in the case that was a DNA match that was 30 plus years later, and she had gone to the preliminary hearing, and she described what it was like to be in that Michigan courtroom when all of a sudden she had tried to piece together her aunt's life from the shards that were, left. I mean, notebooks, journals, people's recollections, but she didn't have a lot to go by. And the case was not solved. There were other cases at that time in 1969 called the Michigan Murders, because there were lots of young women who were killed, and they thought it might be related, but it wasn't necessarily proven. So anyway, there was this DNA match, and so she had gone to the preliminary hearing, and the thing that really struck me was she's describing being in the courtroom, and all of a sudden they pull out the evidence boxes, right? And she described seeing the clothes her aunt was wearing the night that she was murdered. I was like, whoa, what's in police storage? And what do they do with it? And I had been doing work on Holocaust, and I'd been writing about photographs, but oh my God, and and some of you know I really love clothes. So it was like, wait a minute, I hadn't really thought about any of that. So what Ruth is alluding to is I went to do some research. The first research I began for what became this book was trying to figure out what the police do. So I wanted to understand, what are the rules of evidence and how does it work and what is custody? And in the process of kind of reading about laws of evidence and things, I stumbled upon this organization called the International Association for Property and Evidence. And they are an organization that was founded by a former police officer who's trying to professionalize the work of police property management. So I called this guy and he said, yeah, there are only 2 books on this topic and I wrote both of them. Actually, these are my early versions of them. There's this one, which is Evidence and Property Management, and this one is Property and Evidence by the Book. And anyway, he allowed me to join the organization as a non-professional, and they do these 2-day workshops. And so I went to a workshop in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania for 2 days with a bunch of police and law enforcement professionals, and I learned about what they do with evidence. So and there's a whole chapter, as Ruth is alluding to in the book, which is about the arts of custody. And I talk about what it is that police property management is about. But what interests me is that if you don't have a functioning evidence room, then the whole legal system falls apart because no one can either find the stuff or keep it from being contaminated so that it actually functions as evidence. That's the chain of custody, right? The provenance, so you know where it was. So did somebody tamper with it, et cetera. But that labor is really invisibilized in the law because the law thinks of it as extra legal, but there is no legal system without it. But it was an interesting couple of days. It was like library science meets law enforcement, I guess.
What's interesting too, apropos of your course, is that this is a profound understanding of what evidence amounts to. What do we hold on to? What do we give up? What's of value? What can we shed? And those are sort of the profound discussion questions, really, I think that are going to be surfacing in the course that you're taking. What happens at the end of every semester is students are asked to fill out course evaluations. And I have always been a little suspicious of those, even though of course mine have always been glowing. But what I'm suspicious about is that kind of knee jerk, it's the end of the semester, either I loved it or I hated it, but it's very seldom nuanced. And I've always wanted to track down what people who've been out for a few years have had to say. Has this course had any lasting power for them? Has it had any special meaning? Has the promise of an exciting intellectual experience shown up?
So the advice that is frequently given to students is don't take the course, take the professor. Working with Laura is really exciting. Every day, Laura is really willing to let the class go where the class is interested in, right? So if the class wants to talk about, ways of knowing in the art world, or about like what is art or whatever, that's a conversation she'll happily facilitate. And she'll actively pull out people who might not be talking to add things that she knows about them, because when she meets with them one-on-one, she gets to know what their background is, and pull them in to say, hey, I know you know something about this, even though you don't want to say something because it's in front of the whole class. I actually know that you're the expert in the room, relatively speaking, and pulls them in. And her ability to facilitate conversations by pulling in the people who have relevant interests and then making really interesting juxtapositions that move the conversation forward into frequently another discipline or into another topic, but it ties in a way that you never see. Laura's really an expert at this, and it makes every class really exciting. I was always sad when the hour-and-a-half class was over at the end. I mean, certainly you're leaving because you're like, well, you're not staying in class any longer than you have to. There's lots of stuff going on. But you're also disappointed. You're also like, that was a really great conversation. The conversation was really a semester-long one rather than just class. And that makes it really exciting.
I couldn't agree more. I feel like the relationship that I built with Laura persists, right? I got some fabulous Jimmy Choo heels at a secondhand store and I emailed her about it, right? But at the same time, a couple of years ago, I was like, hey, do I want to apply for a Fulbright? And I emailed her about that too. And so the breadth and depth of our relationship that we established in that semester has gone on for, years and years and continues. And so what I would also say is that it's the most honors class I have ever taken. So I took obviously a lot of honors classes while I was at Temple, but what the honors program promises is so delivered and beyond in the evidence class. It is small, it's diverse, it is brilliant, professor driven, and the challenge is yours to rise up and create a space in your area of interest that you can carry out into the world beyond. And so I know, at least for me, the paper that I wrote in Laura's class, in the job that kind of has gone up to the job I currently have today, I got because someone said, I need a writing sample. And I said, here. And I handed them, as an employee of a large corporate consulting firm, my evidence paper to get a role that I have enjoyed forever because I was confident in it and the ideas were relevant even years later.
So what you're saying is you recommend it?
Yeah. Her class never felt like work. It felt like studio time to explore and create, and that was the greatest gift that she gave us.
So we can look forward to a book party, can we not?
I hope so.
A book signing. I feel so I don't know, buoyed up in this pandemic time to hear, like when you're an educator, you just hope to hear these kinds of things, but to hear them and know they're genuine and know this is the kind of thing that goes on at Temple University is just, I don't know, just so uplifting. It's so cheering. I just feel like there's so much promise and so much hope that surrounds this kind of exchange and this kind of community that's been built. And I gather you all get together from time to time, even as many as your old class can gather. Claire, do you have any concluding question for our guests?
Yes, as a part of course, we know that people often ask if you could have a dinner party, who would you invite? Well, Ruth and I already know that we would love to invite all of you to a dinner party because this conversation is so exciting and we want to continue it. But we want to ask you, as hosts of this dinner party, what would be the first course?
I think we have to begin with drinks, clearly. Yeah. I think plain toast and some potato chips would be a lovely way to begin.
Beautiful.
All right, Laura claimed the first course. What's next?
I mean, I always think of meat and cheese boards as like a leading into things, right? That's great. You know, maybe some crudité to go with it, just in case, you know, vegetarians are at the party too, and just sort of cover all your bases. There's someone who wrote about vegetarianism or veganism in France in our class, just to tie it in, just you know, all over the place. But I think that's what I would be bringing if we were hosting.
Right.
Yeah, as in the appetizer vein, I think we should have a salad bar because it's definitely a choose your own adventure.
Exactly. Perfect.
Well said. So Claire, what would you bring?
Definitely some sweets. I think we need some chocolates and some fruit, something to keep it light, keep it sweet.
Well, I would probably make some pasta, but right now I'm in the mood for rhubarb pie. So I think I would have to conclude it with a rhubarb pie and maybe some really good coffee.
Yes.
For sure. Anyway, what?
I'm struck. I just want to say that this is a dinner party without a main course because actually we want to have as much room to just mingle and test and try out things. And I have to say, I like hors d'oeuvres better than I like the main course anyway. So I'm noticing that you all seem to have echoed that sentiment.
Well, thank you all for being here today. I think what fun we've had with this. And, you know, it just, I don't know, it makes me love Temple Honors all the more. And Laura, thank you so much for what you do. And the alums and Claire, you know, this is what we're about. You're our best argument for Temple University.
Yeah, no, I feel so privileged to have worked with the two of you and all of your classmates. And I guess the only other thing I'd say about the dinner party, if I could bring together some of the different cohorts of the class so that you all could know each other, because there were so many wonderful students that I've had over the years. You know, it's a course that doesn't fit like what your mold of what you think you're going to take. And so you have to be willing to risk trying something different to do it. But I think it's really worth the risk, as you all attest to. And for me, it's been a delight. And I'm really excited to get to teach it again because I haven't taught it for a few years.
Well, thank you all for being here, for being who you are and what you do. In the middle of a pandemic, this is just so fresh and so uplifting. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
All right, over and out.
Over and out. Thank you.
You give me pushback. I ask for feature. You give me pushback.